All right, as mentioned, I'm Jakub. I'm founder and CEO of Apiary. And I wanted to kind of use Chris's remark at the start, and when he was saying that most of the problems that he's presenting are pretty obvious, and they would have been at least obvious if they kind of stopped and thought about it for a second. So I want to make you stop and think about for a second about microservices that we talked about. I don't want to talk about why microservices are awesome. I think you've heard all of that today. I want to talk about the problems that microservices face. Because I think, initially everybody can do a very quick, very fast kind of continuous deployment on a simple Hello World app. But where it's really difficult and where it's really kind of critical is scaling this to large system and scaling this to large distributed kind of microservice systems. Which is my way of saying that you're awesome and great when you're trying to make it work in large companies, and you should pay attention to this. But, and so I'm going to start with the simple observations. Microservices are about distributing your application between multiple different nodes. And when you make those nodes small, you kind of push out the complexity onto the network, right? It doesn't really disappear. It just means that those individual parts do less, and so they need to orchestrate together in order to get things done. And so you're pushing out, you're not really eliminating that complexity, you're just pushing it into a different part of the stack. So that's one important thing to realize. The other important thing to realize is the connections actually grow exponentially, right? So as you start kind of adding nodes linearly, the connections between them grow exponentially, and there's a famous kind of chart for that I tried to replicate. And so this is a really, really big problem, because suddenly the complexity of writing software isn't in that code base anymore. It's not in the monolithic code. It's really about how to orchestrate all those things together and how to kind of make sure that the dependencies between them are met. And so that's kind of what I want to talk about. The complexities of microservices at scale, the hidden kind of complexity in the interdependencies and in the APIs that they use to connect to each other, and how to manage that complexity and how to manage the API integration drift. So initial attempts that people initially started doing at trying to kind of rein in some kind of control around APIs is to really kind of create a kind of one thing that I should probably mention here is the technology has vastly changed in the last 10 years, because it was very simple when there was one simple kind of specific protocol called SOAP, for example, which really dictated on how your API should look like. But nowadays, API design and APIs in general are really more a philosophy than a protocol. Everybody can bring their own thing to the table, and everybody can really implement them the way they see fit, which really creates a lot of problems when you're trying to do this at a large scale. And so initial attempts at doing that is to codify some kind of commonality across your company, to create a style guide for your APIs, to talk about it, to distribute it around the company, to create some kind of approval workflow, a process around it, which gets in the way of your developers, gets in the way of actually doing that kind of continuous delivery quickly, but it also doesn't scale because it's very manual, it's very kind of human-facing. And so I think one of the things that we've seen very strongly in the last couple of years is a move to formal descriptions for APIs, right? And if you don't believe me, you can also talk to Kin over there that runs APIevangelist.com, and we've been observing the rise of kind of formal descriptions for APIs very strongly over the last couple of years. And so the trick to having a successful kind of scalable microservice architecture is to really be able to describe formal interfaces and to automate a lot of the process around them. But not only do you have to be kind of able to automate that out of a formal description, but you also have to kind of successfully distribute that around your company. You almost have to culturally implement it into your company, which is hard unless you bring in something that is universally acceptable to developers and that kind of spreads organically among them. So finding a kind of common balance between a very strong kind of formal system, but something that is so simple enough that developers actually love using it and that is so useful that they love using it is really critical. So the two big areas that we've seen kind of emerge out of that, and that we've been leading at Apiary, but other people are doing as well, is design automation, API design automation, and API lifecycle automation. And I want to talk about one of them each briefly and show you the examples of why they help. First one, API design automation, or I even dare to use the G word here, design governance. Are my APIs well designed is the kind of number one thing to think about. Traditionally, in a kind of older API model, API is a very strong waterfall process. It's one of those things that you design first, ultimately and completely and exhaustively, the version 1, and then you deploy the whole thing into production, and only then are you going to start finding out how people actually use your API, right? That's a very strong anti-pattern, and also it's kind of a question how to solve that, how to break that up without kind of deploying new version of an API every day and changing them continuously and managing all the different version problems. And so I think for us, what we've seen very strongly, what works in the industry, is focused on rapid iteration even before the deployment of an API, actually, and to pull in customers into that design conversation. And around microservices, this is even more important because it's actually internal. So you have that very strong capability to actually unlock the dependency between kind of building an API and using an API. You can almost build them in parallel. You can build and use them in parallel, and through the usage of them, actually discover what are the dependencies and what are the requirements for APIs. The other color of it is, are they actually consistent across the company, which becomes really, really unmanageable once you face hundreds of APIs, and once you cross the boundary of being able to review them manually. So we have one successful customer from New Zealand, which has got a funny story. I mean, typically when you talk about consistency, there's all these dry topics like what are the timestamp formats, or what are the data formats that we use across our APIs, which is really hard to kind of explain on a talk. But they have a very unique problem. They absolutely hate American spelling. They're a British company, and they need to have all the S's, in all of those places, and they absolutely hate debugging the problems of chasing the one character that's wrong somewhere deep in their code base because somebody has pluralized it in the wrong way. And so they came to us, and they have a couple hundred developers using Apiary. They drive all of their API designs through Apiary. They have all of those formal descriptions. They said, we'd love to have a formal system that actually allows us to standardize on British spelling. And so we did that. And so it's very easy for them, and now it actually scales with their company very, very quickly. The other area that I want to talk about is lifecycle governance. And I think for this one particularly, that's one that's really important in the continuous delivery area, because what you really need to do and to achieve kind of throughput is to move through that whole life cycle of what happens in software very, very quickly and multiple times over. And so you don't really have that time of kind of spending time of handing over from the individual stages in your kind of engineering organization, and you need to kind of automate that process as much as possible. So some of the things that we talk about is staying informed of upcoming changes, the dependencies impact between multiple different sections of your software, seeing what's coming up 2 weeks down the road, 5 weeks down the road in other organizations in your company. And I have this kind of chart that shows how we're thinking about that life cycle, going from design to prototyping very quickly, going to implementation, delivery, and finally the important piece that Michael Cote talked about, the feedback, going back and feeding the design loop again. And this is a lot of stuff, right? And this is just in the API space, generating documentations for APIs, prototyping APIs, generating test-driven tests, for those APIs, writing code examples, delivering SDKs, collecting usage metrics. All of this stuff is really, really big. And if you need to do this, multiple times a week, that takes up a lot of resources. But in the API space specifically, this can actually be automated. Vast majority of this can be automated if you have a formal description that can actually help you move through that life cycle. So that's about it. One last thing that I always hear people say, is this SOA? Is this kind of, are we coming back to the whole kind of, WSDL and the governance that we all saw so dramatically fail in the 2000s? And I've already heard a couple of people in the audience today say, I actually think conceptually and philosophically that wasn't such a bad idea, but it's kind of difficult to talk about it in front of developers because it was really awful, right? Everybody knows that. Well, it is and it isn't, right? I mean, I think some of the concepts of trying to move through that pipeline as quickly as possible and automate as much as possible are very sound. The problem was in the detail, in the implementation, in the kind of very heavy-handed top-down implementation. And I think what we're seeing now emerge is a new generation of technology around APIs that's very lightweight, very non-invasive, very developer-friendly, with obvious benefits to developers, and as a result of that, kind of fundamentally adopted from the bottom and organically in a company without the need to kind of drive it hard to the company, but with the ability to actually automate all of this and use the formal descriptions to automate your teams and integrate them together. And if you don't believe me, we have over 100,000 developers using formal description systems, and that's just the ones we know about, and there's plenty more that are using other technology. So this is a new wave coming in. That's kind of a new generation of developers growing up on this. And so I think this is, without a doubt, kind of going to define how we're going to build APIs in the future. So, summary, use formal descriptions. Think about starting early in your life cycle and automate as much as possible. The trick is in the integration to avoid that kind of deadlock with your microservices. Thank you for your attention.